This episode of New Politics was released on the 28th of June, 2025, and produced on the lands of the Wongal and Whadjuk people.
Hello to our audience again, and hello to you, David. I hope you've had a very good week.
Thanks, Eddie. Yes, hello to everyone. I've had a good week. I hope everyone out there's had a good week too. It's been a big week.
Well, it's always a big week. I'm just over in Perth at the moment. It's freezing cold and it's been very wet. I'm not sure if this is typical winter weather for Perth. I thought it was a nice warm place, but anyway, there you go. But coming up in the episode, we've still got the lingering effects of the conflicts in the Middle East. Australia is still licking the boots of the United States and quite a few other places as well. We also look at the performances of Penny Wong as the Foreign Minister and whether we should be allowed to discuss national security issues or not. And we also ask the big question, is the Albanese government starting to waste its political capital again? And we also look briefly at the Antoinette Lattouf case. And that's all coming up in this very exciting episode of New Politics, David.
As always, I can't wait.
We've seen one of the most dangerous escalations in the Middle East for a long, long time, and that was when the United States bombed 3 nuclear facilities in Iran using stealth bombers in a massive strike during the week. And this follows on from the unprovoked attacks by Israel on Iran the previous week and the subsequent retaliation by Iran. And this is a big international incident, but we didn't hear anything at all from the Australian government for almost 24 hours. The Prime Minister Anthony Albanese and Foreign Minister Penny Wong made no comment at all on the day. And who knows, maybe they were just having a bit of a sleep-in on the Sunday morning. And then they finally came out with the predictable response that they were backing the actions of the United States. Now, there is a ceasefire that is very delicate at the moment, and as we saw in Palestine, Israel is already claiming that the other side has broken the truce and will continue its attacks on Iran. So I guess we'll just have to see what happens there. But for me, it's obvious that the involvement of the United States was for no big reason at all. It was a military gamble that risks dragging the entire region into an open war. But as we discussed last week, David, this is primarily about the political survival of Benjamin Netanyahu and for Donald Trump as well, and the American military-industrial complex. And we also heard the United States president engage in some very, very, very bad language during the week.
You know what? We basically have two countries that have been fighting so long and so hard that they don't know what the fuck they're doing. Do you understand that?
But closer to home, Australia's response is just more of the same. Whatever the United States wants, the United States gets, and we will not stand in the way. And we always do have to remember our place in the world, but at least you'd expect that when the United States does something that contravenes international conventions and international law, that we would have something to say about that, but apparently not.
What was disappointing was not that they took so long to reply, because it's complex, it's difficult, there are many traps to avoid, and to take a day to craft a statement I didn't think was unreasonable. What was so disappointing was that the statement was so predictable in the end. Or they presumably went through every single option and went with the John Howard circa 1997, even Harold Holt, all the way with LBJ of 1967, which was disappointing. We have a unique opportunity to step away from some of the less in the national interest ties of the alliance, and they're not doing it. That's not to say to break the alliance. It's not to say to ignore the United States, because Trump won't last forever and Trump's people won't last forever. But a message needs to be sent to the United States that Australia doesn't approve of this type of American government, and we don't really support the types of actions it's been doing domestically or internationally. Now, again, I said last week that we shouldn't look for regime change in countries unless the people there want them and us, especially for our help, and I stand by that. But we can disapprove, and the Australian government clearly disapproves of many governments around the world. We can disapprove of the current American administration, all the while keeping our alliance intact at least, even if there's a cooling.
And as we discussed last week, David, the media keep framing this according to partisan lines. The United States and Israel are on the side of right, and Iran is the evil rogue state on the other side. And this is to be expected. The coverage in the West is radically different to the coverage that I've seen on Al Jazeera and other non-Western media. And across all the flurry of madness that we've seen over the past week, one of the most sane political commentaries that I've seen came from the Iranian Foreign Minister, Abbas Araghchi.
The United States itself has now also opted for a dangerous military operation and aggression against the people of Iran. In doing so, the U.S. administration holds sole and full responsibility for the consequences of its actions, including the Islamic Republic of Iran's right to self-defense under the principles of the United Charter. In accordance with the UN Charter and its provisions allowing a legitimate response in self-defense, Iran reserves all options to defend its security, interests, and people.
And much of the Australian media has parroted United States-Israeli talking points, and a lot of the coverage was dominated by Western sources, embedded correspondents in Tel Aviv, and the constant use of phrases like Iran's aggression and Israel's right to self-defence, and we've come to expect that. And they keep claiming that it's so hard to get information from within Iran, but other international networks don't seem to have the same problem. So maybe they're just not trying hard enough because they don't need to. And the ABC caused a bit of a ruckus during the week, where on the day of the United States attack on Iran, they invited the former Prime Minister Scott Morrison to give his assessments and pretty much a pro-war perspective.
Well, the entry of the United States directly into this in an offensive capacity with the strikes that we've seen today is obviously a very significant change in what we've seen in the conflict so far. President Trump clearly had no further options available to him other than to do what only the US military could do. It wasn't like Israel could have undertaken what we've just seen. And it is certainly not something I think the president has rushed towards or even preferred, but he's been resolute about the need to resolve this issue. And clearly that was only going to occur with what we've seen today. Now, with that action, I think it is still contained. It was very direct in where they struck. And the message he has sent clearly to the regime is the ball is very much in their court, and it's time to end this and to move towards a peace.
Scott Morrison is a former Prime Minister, and as bad as he was, I think that we should be able to hear his perspectives, even if it is just to remind us about how bad he was as Prime Minister. But the ABC neglected to mention his role on the advisory board of Thales Australia, one of Australia's largest arms manufacturers. Maybe that's just a small detail and easy to overlook, David. But the best one for me was Mike Pezzullo, the disgraced former Home Affairs Secretary who was sacked by the Labor government for political interference and leaking confidential advice. And the ABC decided to bring him on to give his perspectives too. And it wasn't just for 30 seconds or a minute or two. He was given a good 10-minute segment as well. And here's one of the exchanges between David Spears and Mike Pezzullo on the ABC.
Much debate over whether this US strike was legal or not. You're not an international law expert, nor am I. But I do want to ask you whether this now sets a new precedent, as some have said, of might is right. Can a big power now launch a preemptive strike on a smaller power on the grounds that it's acting in self-defence?
Well, this goes to the nub of the efforts, for instance, to convince George Bush, Bush 43 that is, to go to the UN, for instance.
They announce that they're not experts in international law, but then proceed to provide their non-expert analysis on international law. And it's not clear why the ABC is trying to rehabilitate some of these people, either who left office in disgrace, or the public service in disgrace. There's a lot of experts out there who can provide much better analysis. They're easy to find. Now, I'm not suggesting that the ABC hasn't had anyone with expertise. They have been doing that, and some of them have been pretty good, but I'm just not sure why they'd need to include people who haven't really got much to offer when there's just so many people out there who can.
It's clear that the ABC is in a lot of disarray at the moment. Their new managing director wants to bring in a 1980s style broadcasting model, which won't work in 2025. Their news is patchy. You still get some really good reports and even shows on the ABC, but a lot of it is junk. And while I acknowledge that Scott Morrison was Prime Minister, I don't think that he's got very much of any use to say to a national audience. I think the election results he got tend to support that. And unlike some prime ministers and leaders who weren't terribly regarded at the time, but with historical hindsight, we realised they weren't so bad after all. Truman springs to mind in American politics. In Australian politics, it's a bit hard because pre-Morrison, they all polished up pretty well when we realised how bad things could actually get. I guess John Hewson would be an example of someone who is regarded a lot better now than he was at the time. He loses the unlosable election. So he had some regard anyway because he was expected to win. Given the disarray of the Liberal Party, people see John Hewson when he speaks and say this is a man who would have been a very good Prime Minister. It is unlikely Scott Morrison will be rehabilitated historically, no matter how much he tries to twist the narrative. Robo-debt was enough for that, let alone all of the other missteps, scandals, mistakes, errors, and out-and-out corruption that he had. So I don't know why they bring him on. Even John Howard, who's 86, 87, and starting to look his age in a way. But even John Howard would be preferable. Malcolm Turnbull would be preferable. Even Tony Abbott would be preferable, let alone any of the Labor who had more experience in dealing with Middle East crises, or even an ex-foreign minister, Bob Carr. It gets harder on the Liberal side.
Well, as I mentioned before, we do have Prime Ministers do have a right to speak publicly. I don't have an issue with that, but it's just that of all people, why choose Scott Morrison on a day like this?
And he's an unpaid pro-vice chair or whatever nonsense title they gave him for an advisory committee. So it's not as if he's Christopher Pine is higher up the chain. I don't want to really hear from Christopher Pine either, to be quite frank. But yeah, they need to declare ex-Prime Minister of Australia, sure, okay, good, and arms lobbyist to the United States. And then what he says can be weighed a little bit more. It doesn't necessarily make what he says invalid, although in this case it probably does. But yet we need to know these associations and these potential conflicts and these positions just so we can say, okay, that makes sense. You know, if we were getting in somebody to talk about the reduction of sugar in food and why we shouldn't do that, and it turns out that they didn't mention that they were the owner of Australia's biggest sugar refining mill, that changes whatever they have to say profoundly. It doesn't necessarily negate it, but it does give them a bias.
Well, it might also be hard for the ABC to announce, well, here we have the former disgraced Prime Minister Scott Morrison or the former disgraced public servant Mike Pezzullo up in our next segment. It's a bit hard for them to say that.
Yes, although there's a lot of former disgraced in the ABC after the Antoinette Lattouf case yesterday. So they should just have that as the default. And yes, I'm still happy to go on the ABC and they can call me former disgraced because that's absolutely true too.
And there's also that issue of the United Nations and that link with international law. And we have to remember that Australia was instrumental in the creation of the United Nations all those years ago, 1948. Doc Evatt, former Labor Attorney General, former leader of the Labor Party as well, and President of the United Nations General Assembly. He was there at the inception of the United Nations. Australia was a big part of the creation of the post-war international system, United Nations, International Monetary Fund, Bretton Woods Agreement. Australia was there with that idea of defending smaller nations and pushing for global cooperation and a rules-based order. And I think after all the diplomatic conversations that have pretty much gone on since October 2023, and Australia's unbridled support for every action of the United States. I just think that legacy lies in ruins. When the US launches airstrikes, Penny Wong and Richard Marles just seem to nod along. When Israel pushes through with its genocide in Gaza, Albanese just looks the other way. When activists speak up, there's police action against them, and artists and writers get cancelled by the pro-Israel lobby. And in this case, Australia couldn't even say if the United States had broken any international conventions or international law. And the main reason is that there is no rules-based international order anymore. That's dead and probably has been for some time. And this is probably a longer-term issue, but the United Nations Security Council reflects the world of 1945, not the world of 2025. And we've got the five powers from the Second World War: United States, Britain, China, France and Russia. Well, they're dominating world diplomacy, even though not all of them really deserve to be there. And I think that structure has to be reformed. And it's not going to happen for some time, I do accept that. But until it does, I think we're just going to keep having this sort of situation in the Middle East just keep happening time and again.
Yeah, the Security Council, with the US, a fading power, Britain, a faded power, the USSR, now Russia, a power that's gone and been replaced and is a middling power. It doesn't reflect the world now. And there's this incredible amount of influence that the Security Council has. It would be better, I guess, for it to be China, Germany. It can't be Europe. The EU doesn't involve itself in international relations, leaving that to its member countries. China, Germany, India, and maybe Brazil or Korea. Although I think you want it spread around the world, so you'd have either China or Korea rather than two countries from the same region. Of course, the countries in the Security Council aren't going to give it up, so there's that. But more relevant suggestions to a modern world might be forced through by the UN and reflect the modern world. We have a rising power in China, whether we like it or not. We have a falling power in the United States, whether we like it or not. We can argue both ways as to why I'm right or wrong, but the US has declined over the last 40 years. That decline has possibly been hastened since the last election.
Seems to have gone quite downhill since 2016 or thereabouts.
Yeah. We're stuck in a 1940s, 1950s model, which is now 80 years old and doesn't reflect. And this is how major catastrophic wars start. Old models. It's World War I, old models. They were activating treaties that were 100 years old, and that reflected a completely different world, which was World War I. So not all the treaties were that old, but the one that brought Britain in was about saving Belgium from Napoleon. World War II wasn't much better. This is how you get those catastrophic wars. They probably need to circumvent US influence till the US sorts itself out. Britain circumvented its own interest when it left Europe, so that's okay. The United Nations should reflect the world as it is, and the world as we'd like it to be, not the world as it was.
This is New Politics with Eddie Djokovic and David Lewis. You can also find us at newpolitics.com.au, and you can also support us through Patreon and Substack.
In relation to what is occurring in the Middle East, Australia has been clear, along with the international community, that Iran cannot be allowed to develop a nuclear weapon. We support action to prevent that from occurring, and this is what this is. What I would also say is we know that the international nuclear watchdog, the International Atomic Energy Agency, has made clear that Iran has enough heavily enriched uranium for several nuclear bombs. That has been made clear. It has also said that Iran is not in compliance with its obligations under the non-proliferation arrangements that it has signed up to.
There's been a few questions from our audience about whether Penny Wong is one of the more unprincipled foreign ministers that we've ever had. And at the heart of this question, or how we assess this question, is whether a foreign minister is acting in Australia's national interests or not. And we've previously given Penny Wong a lot of credit in the past for patching up the relationship with China over the past 3 years and for re-establishing Australia's role within the Pacific region. But I think that her role with these Middle East issues has been quite woeful over the past 18 months. And when it comes to unprincipled behaviour by foreign ministers, there's been quite a few examples of this in Australia. Alexander Downer and his role in bugging the East Timorese government in 2004 when they were a newly formed independent nation. He also argued that Australia had to join the invasion of Iraq in 2003 because it would have been commercially beneficial to Australia. Then there's Gareth Evans negotiating the Timor Gap deal with Indonesia in 1989 while the corrupt Suharto government was committing human rights abuses against the people of East Timor. And as bad as all of that behaviour was, at least you could see that they were acting in Australia's interest. Even though the way that they were acting was pretty terrible, but at least you could see that they were acting in Australia's interest. But whose interest is Penny Wong acting in? She can't even say whether international law has been broken by the United States, even though it clearly has. She won't call out a genocide in Gaza when that's clearly what's happening. So I guess that's what the question is. Whose interest is Penny Wong serving? Is it Israel? Is it the United States? Because it's hard to see how any of this is in Australia's national interest.
It's
and are we being a bit unfair, David?
Ultimately, none of them were in Australia's interest, but in the short term they were, yes. So I don't think we're being terribly unfair. Whereas Penny Wong is struggling, and she's probably the most articulate of all of those foreign ministers, and I say that with a pretty decent knowledge of Gareth Evans's background. And I don't think anyone listening will disagree that Alexander Downer was a terrible foreign minister. But Penny Wong, I think it's the disappointment. She was a very strong performer in opposition. She was across everything. She was tough when she needed to be tough, compassionate when she needed to be compassionate, articulate, well argued, well thought through, a very hard worker. Now, some of this hasn't changed. She's still articulate, except she's choosing not to be. She's still a very hard worker, but she seems to have folded to some kind of outside force. We don't know what's happened at Pine Gap, and Pine Gap should be open to Australian scrutiny, given its obvious key role in American defence expansion. We shouldn't be involved in the Middle East, except to get Australian citizens out when they're in danger. That's important. There's quite a few people who do business in the Middle East. And it's not just the countries that are directly involved that is the problem. It's the surrounding countries that these things always seem to spill over into. Lebanon, Syria, Jordan. And of course, things like airspace, domestic flights in and out get compromised. And there's always the low but still real risk that a commercial non-military aircraft or ship will be destroyed accidentally or on purpose with Australian nationals or Australian citizens on it. Australia's role should be to protect our citizens who are there and not to send more of our citizens in the guise of defence people over to interfere in things that have no direct bearing on us. And for all of Downer's talk about improved commercial, we didn't get a lot of improved commercial relations out of the Gulf Wars, except we probably bought a few more weapons from American, and they may have bought a few more weapons from us. That doesn't really help. That's not like building school halls, which had a flow-on effect into the local communities, for example. I don't know what happened to Penny Wong. I don't know why she stopped being the person she was. Now, I do understand that as foreign minister, things are a whole lot different. You have to work within the surrounding rules. Alexander Downer never seemed to compromise his lack of principles. Gareth Evans didn't seem to compromise his principles too much. Again, sometimes you've got to accept what happens. But they were always able to argue why they went the way that they did. Penny Wong doesn't seem to have. And this is heartbreaking. As I said, she was one of the absolute very best performers. And there was always talk for her to move from the Senate into the lower house so that she might become Prime Minister. Those calls have abated somewhat. I don't know if she can come back.
the Albanese government and Penny Wong in particular, well, they are starting to use that same language that we used to hear from the Morrison era. That idea of, well, we don't comment on national security matters. And Scott Morrison used to say we don't comment on water matters, but it's a similar sort of process. And it's just a lazy way of ignoring a difficult political issue or difficult political issues. And it's usually given in response to these sorts of questions from journalists.
Prime Minister, what intelligence has been shared with your government about whether Iran was imminently at the point of having a nuclear weapon? And following on from Jane's question,
refer to previous answer.
You're a government that talks about transparency and talks about being upfront with the Australian people. So was a facility like Pine Gap used in this attack? Was information that's been garnered there used as part of this attack on Iran?
We are upfront, but we don't talk about intelligence, obviously. But we've made very clear this was unilateral action taken by the United States.
And I'm not expecting Albanese to come out and give out sensitive security details or classified information or anything like that. But this issue about what role Australia is playing in some of these international incidents, and Pine Gap in the middle of Australia and any other intelligence, I think that Australians need to know how all of this is being used and how we are being used in this conflict or any other conflict. And are there any other issues that we need to know about? Is Australia being used to assist Israel in its actions in Gaza or any other conflicts around the world? And instead, we end up getting a government openly misleading the public, not only about the actions of the United States, but the actions of Australia as well. And that might be the reason why Australia has supported the United States bombing of Iran, because we were actually a part of it.
It's a sad chapter of Australian foreign policy history, and it should be, if not a golden age, it should be a period where we have a really capable person at the helm and a modern and dynamic Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and we don't have that, and I'm not sure that we will get it. I hope we do, but I can't see offhand how we will.
And while there were some criticisms about the government being silent for 24 hours after the United States bombed Iran, the coalition was only too happy to fill the void. And we had the Shadow Minister for Defence, Andrew Hastie, calling for the government to have more transparency about how the United States military is using Australia. And I fully agree. There needs to be a lot more transparency about that relationship between Australia and the United States military. But I think it's just a little bit rich coming from Andrew Hastie. He was a part of the coalition government that organised a $380 billion AUKUS deal in complete secrecy. I'm not even sure if cabinet members knew about that at the time. And that ended up costing Australia about $5 billion in cancellation fees with the French Naval Group after those submarine contracts were cancelled. Locked us into a 30-year deal with the United States and Britain through the AUKUS deal, possibly even longer, paying for submarines that we're never going to get. And here we have the Liberal Party lecturing us about transparency. So, of course, this is a bit of political posturing. Yes, we do need to have a lot more transparency, but you talk about this when you're in government and you've got the ability to implement some transparency, not calling for it when you're in opposition and can't do anything about it.
Yeah, I'll acknowledge that being in opposition is a much easier job than being in government. But again, the lack of courage has been just disappointing.
I guess you can be as courageous as you like in opposition. It's the performance in government that really counts.
Yeah.
You got to have that courage when you're in government, not when you're in opposition.
It's not courage till you're in a position to actually do it, though. One of the reasons that the Liberal Party lost was that they would say one thing and do another. You don't want Labor to be in the same boat as that, but it looks like that's what's happening.
Oh, it's a little bit like Malcolm Turnbull. Malcolm Turnbull has been very, very courageous since he left Parliament. But he wasn't very courageous when he was Prime Minister.
Yeah.
And that's the point. You do these things when you're in government, when you've got the power to do these sort of things, not when you haven't got the power.
Yeah, anyone can talk. People, with all the gratitude I can muster, come in and listen to us talk every week. And that's fantastic. But when you're in a position to do, you should do. And often the hardest questions are the easiest to answer. You just do the right thing. And we haven't had a lot of that.
This is New Politics, available through Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Audible and YouTube, and also available to support at Patreon, Substack, and at our website, newpolitics.com.au.
And there are some concerns developing that the Labor government is starting to squander its political capital again and on these issues related to the Middle East and Gaza, foreign affairs. And the last election was less than 2 months ago, and Parliament hasn't actually sat yet for this parliamentary term. So it's definitely too early to tell. But for me, some of those warning signs are there. Now, it took a while for this to set in during the last term. After the 2022 election, I think that most people were just happy to see the back of the Morrison government and gave Anthony Albanese a lot of credit for most of the first 18 months of that term. Then the Voice to Parliament issue from about the middle of 2023 burned months of political attention and internal energy from the government. 2024 was a bit of a flat year, a year of political drift, and there were actually concerns towards the end of 2024 that the government was going to lose the next election in 2025. Yet none of this meandering or drifting cost them at the election. And while Labor did manage to achieve quite a bit during that first term, they mainly won that 2025 election because Peter Dutton was the alternative and ran the worst election campaign pretty much in history. And Labor might have actually lost that 2025 election just a couple of months ago or got into a minority government position if the Liberal Party had a decent leader during that term and ran a half-decent and competent election campaign. But that didn't happen. There are some issues popping up related to complacency within the government, and that's when you start hearing we don't discuss national security issues or just giving out the messages that people want to hear rather than doing the hard work of being able to articulate these messages into something more meaningful. And I think this is where the danger is, that if you start governing like you're bulletproof or immune from everything, you just stop listening and start believing that managing perceptions is the same as managing real problems. And that was an issue for the Morrison government, and I think the potential is there for the Labor government as well. I'm not saying that it will happen or it's definitely happening, but I can just see a few little signs there.
Again, political capital is there to burn against the people who oppose your good policies. You're going to lose votes initially for topping up Medicare, but ultimately that's a good thing. And you will gain those votes back when the benefits come through, when people aren't paying a fortune to see a specialist or choosing to live in pain and discomfort because your private health insurance is just not able to cover your specialist and the gap isn't enough. The Medicare gap is almost insulting. So that's the type of thing. Fixing the education sector, not just one sector of it, but from preschool through to tertiary education. We saw this week Macquarie University is cutting its politics and its sociology departments. This is appalling. Wollongong University is a basket case. KPMG came in and just slashed and burned. Now we don't know what Wollongong University is going to be because there's not much left. Same with Adelaide, same with Sydney, same with New South Wales, same with Melbourne. They're cutting academic jobs, but not replacing them with anything. Okay, the housing crisis. This is something in which Labor could say, yes, we're committing $100 million to public housing and we're going to target it in the areas in which it's most needed. And if that happens to be prime real estate for developers, bad luck. You can find other places to build in where that type of development is more required. Instead, they're folding to the United States, they're folding to other interest groups, mining and other interest groups that are just burning political capital on their own side. Now, I know they've got a huge majority, but I'd have thought that maintaining a large majority would have been a priority too, and that you burn the political capital you can afford to burn, not the political capital you can't afford to burn.
And people might be thinking, well, what's the Middle East got to do with Australia? What's it got to do with us? And that's a very good point. Now, David, it might be an important issue for you and me and a lot of people that we know and a lot of other people in Australia who take a strong interest in this issue. So I'm not saying that it's only a small amount of people. There's obviously quite a few people, but I just don't think that it's a big political issue in Australia. But it's not so much the issue itself, it's the management of the issue. And in some sense, Middle East or the relationship with the United States and just kowtowing to the United States in every sort of possible way, it's a marginal issue. But for me, in some sense, it's similar to the Voice to Parliament campaign in 2023. That was also a marginal issue. A lot of people didn't understand it, but it was important to Indigenous people and a lot of the people that supported the Voice to Parliament campaign. But the issue itself, politically, it was totally mishandled by the Albanese government, and I think it derailed the actions of government for close to 18 months. It didn't cost them the 2025 federal election, but I think they did meander and have that drift throughout pretty much all of 2024 and a bit of 2025. Now, the Labor government, they've actually got a 51-seat majority in Parliament, and part of their thinking might be, and this is what did happen to the coalition, part of the thinking of the Labor government might be, oh, well, we stuffed up that issue completely in 2023, but we still ended up winning the election. We drifted off in 2024, but hey, look at us, we're still in government, and now we will continue with that sort of behaviour because it doesn't seem to make any difference. Now, I'm not suggesting that that will happen to this government, but we've seen this sort of stuff happen to governments before, whether it's the coalition government or a Labor government. All governments seem to fall into a similar trap of political behaviour, and once they're in there, it's just very hard to get out of it.
Yeah, they need a reset. Now, I'm not saying to replace the leadership.
2 months after an election?
Yeah, that would have been the solution. Rudd Gillard Rudd years, that would have been the solution. Oh, let's replace him with someone. Anyone. Oh, no, not them. Someone else. Back to the original. Well, we're ready for an election now. Oh, we lost. How could we lose? So I don't think but I think a changing in the mentality of the leadership is vital. The Labor government has done some good things. I think we've got to acknowledge that, not because I'm a paid-up member of the Labor Party under Schill and everything else, but because when you look at this stuff, you've got to say, well, what have they done well? What have they done badly? They're failing in Middle Eastern foreign affairs. They're not great on the environment at the moment, and they're not very good at treating the opposition as an opposition. And I've mentioned some of the other things that they're not terribly good at. But bumping up Medicare is a good thing. That's a great thing, and that may be the legacy that we remember this government for. They took Medicare back in the right direction. As an example of the government doing well at something, and yes, I know it hasn't been passed yet, but I think it will pass. I think, though, they've got to start to improve on those things that they haven't done very well. And that may require a reshuffle. That may require a rethink of who's doing what and how they're doing it. And it might not mean moving ministers out of their positions, but it might mean making them go a different way, as in making their decisions be a bit different.
And it's not everyone within government that agrees with all of these processes. There are other voices that are becoming more prominent. Ed Husich, the former Labor minister, was saying the bleeding obvious when he said this.
A middle order power like ours needs to be able to have relationships with a range of different countries. Obviously, we've got a historic connection with the US. Does that mean we have to agree with every single thing that they do? I don't think it does. And I think a lot of Australians would have the same view. We don't have to agree. And in fact, we should stand on the basis of our national interest. My big concern in terms of what we've been seeing is a fraying of the rules-based order and that means something to middle order powers like ours, because you can't simply have strong nations decide that they'll do what they want without regard to international opinion by virtue of their strength. And so it is important for us as a country to argue about the value of an international rules-based order, not merely to say that it's fraying and that it's not, that things are going in a way that we can't do anything about it. Quite the contrary, it's up to us and other countries like ours to argue that, because it is in our national interest. And if it means standing up to the US and arguing our case, we should do so.
And it seems that Ed Husich is more in tune with what the Labor Party should be about than most of the other ministers in the Labor government, and he's almost becoming the voice of the Labor Party in the same way that Petro Georgiou became the voice of the Liberal Party when they became a right-wing Conservative party in the 1990s. And it might just be a case where all governments or all middle powers like Australia are just going to be gutless when the pressure arrives internationally. Bob Hawke couldn't lick the boots of the United States enough during the Gulf War in 1991. Paul Keating always acquiesced to Indonesia over East Timor, always quickly closed down that debate. And Bob Hawke and Paul Keating are Labor Party heroes. But when the pressure came internationally on certain issues, they behaved quite cowardly. And it's frustrating when Australia just does not change its tune at all when it comes to the United States or to Israel, because whatever the United States does, Australia will just follow, irrespectively of how badly it behaves. And it seems like it doesn't really matter if the Labor government has got a 51-seat majority, or even if they held all 150 seats in the lower house and every single Senate seat. Even when there's no possibility at all of a political blowback, this is the course of action that they're going to take when they're in government. And I guess there's no hope of changing that. We've seen that in the past. We're seeing that currently. It's always going to be like this.
I guess when it gets down to it, a politician is a politician. Votes matter first. Power in your particular faction matters next. Maintaining your job is then next. Loyalty to the party. And then coming in at number 5 after daylight and moonlight is the needs of the Australian people and Australia's best interests. And I might be wrong there, and I might be being too harsh there, but after a week of very upsetting events, it's hard not to be cynical, and it's hard not to be disappointed. And I still have a bit of hope, but that hope is fading.
In December 2023, I shared a Human Rights Watch post because Human Rights Watch found that Israel was using starvation as a weapon of war in Gaza. It is now June 2025 and Palestinian children are still being starved. We see their images every day, emaciated, skeletal, scavenging through the rubble for scraps. This unspeakable suffering is not accidental, it is engineered. Deliberately starving and killing children is a war crime. Today the court has found that punishing someone for sharing facts about these war crimes is also illegal. I was punished for my political opinion.
And we've mainly been focusing on international issues today, but there's always things going on in the background. And closer to home, the Antoinette Lattouf case was dealt with in the federal court, and the judge, Darryl Rangier, handed down his decision, and he found in favour of Antoinette Lattouf that she was unfairly terminated by the ABC in 2023 after she posted material from Human Rights Watch that Israel was using starvation as a tool of war, and that she was terminated under a lot of pressure from the Israel lobby in Sydney. And the ABC acted unlawfully. They wasted well over $1 million in defending this case, and it's a case that just should never have happened. The ABC should not be behaving like this. They shouldn't have sacked Antoinette Lattouf in the first place, and I hope they learn a big lesson out of this.
I was talking to an IR lawyer yesterday about this case, and she said there's no way that the board should have been involved, let alone the chairman of the board. There's no way that the managing director should have been involved. I put it to her that it'd be like sacking the cleaner for turning up 10 minutes late. And she said, yeah, pretty much. Those types of things aren't done at that level. And Antoinette Lattouf had 2 days left on her contract. All they had to do was let that contract end and not hire again. And we'd have all speculated as to why. The ABC would have been on a much sounder legal footing. There's a clause in these contracts that the party can terminate the contract at the end for any reason that doesn't have to be stated. And so thanks, Antoinette. Great job. Good luck in the future. Antoinette goes off to a career. Ida Buttrose retains her reputation. David Andrews retains his reputation. The guy who hired Antoinette, who apparently is no longer with the ABC, retains his reputation. The people who forced it don't need a 10-year suppression order on their name.
Well, it's just a massive amount of reputational damage to the ABC.
And yeah, the ABC retains its reputation, or it slows its declining reputation down. and they're not going to appeal. There's been enough damage done so far. Costs still have to be awarded. That will hopefully cover most, if not all, of Antoinette Lattouf's legal costs, but we'll see.
That's it for this episode of New Politics. Thanks for listening in. And if you'd like to support our style of journalism and commentary, please make a donation at our website at newpolitics.com.au. We don't beg, plead, beseech or gaslight you about journalism coming to an end. We just keep it very simple. If you like what we do, please send some support our way. It keeps our commitment to independent journalism ticking along. I'm Eddie Djokovic. Thanks for listening in, and it's goodbye to our listeners.
I'm David Lewis. We'll see you next time.